Welcome everybody to the Cornerstone Care Solutions and Acuity Law Navigating the Business of Care webinar. This is part of a series of webinars that we've been presenting aimed at the health and social care sector, centering around hot topics and things that we feel providers need to be aware of in part of the delivery of their services. So we have done sessions on changes in immigration law, we've done sessions on the changes of regulations and the CQC framework, but today we're focusing on the practical impact of April's national minimum wage change and national insurance rises and how that's going to affect the social care sector. So we have a really interesting set of presenters. I say that and then I start with myself, which is a little bit vain, but I'm one of them. I'm Jenny Well, I'm a partner here at Acuity Law. I specialise in regulatory advice aimed at the health and social care sector. So helping people with anything related to CQC, inquests, safeguarding, any kind of enforcement action or investigation. And more pertinently to this discussion today is challenges to fees as paid by commissioners. We have my colleague Juliet Franklin, Legal Director in the Employment Law Department, who's going to be taking us through what the changes in the law are that relate to these increased costs. And then we're going to pass over to my colleague Sabina Causa, who is the partner in our Immigration Department. Where there are changes with how you pay staff, there is going to be a knock-on effect with those who are overseas workers. So Sabina is going to be running through what those changes are. And then we're lucky enough to be joined by Lucy Corner and Charlie Light of Cornerstone Care Solutions, who are going to reflect on how this is going to impact businesses in a practical sense and offering a few hints and tips. So Juliet's managing workforce issues will kick us off for the day and look at how you can balance your corporate responsibility with the legal changes, looking at the impact on skilled workers and thresholds from Sabina. Charlie and Lucy with the assessment of practical financial impacts on staffing with their very important hints and tips. And then I'll be wrapping up proceedings with how CQC and local authorities are going to be perceiving these changes and what they expect from you as a provider. So without any further ado, I invite Juliet to take control of the slides and kick things off with managing workforce issues, balancing the changes, and corporate responsibility. Thanks, Juliet.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and hopefully my touching of the slides has not messed anything up and you can still all see what you're supposed to be seeing. As Jenny said, my name's Juliet. I'm a legal director in the employment and HR team here at Acuity. What I'm going to focus on today, you'll be pleased to know, is probably less about the law and more about the HR, but recognising that we have to manage the HR issues within the confines of the legal requirements. So we're going to touch on the law, but hopefully there's going to be quite a lot of practical considerations for providers as to how they can manage these changes, manage their workforce, but also remain competitive and successful in an ever-challenging environment. There we are. Apologies for that. So just starting off really at what an overview of what changes we have coming in a little over 3 weeks now. It's going to be quite a seismic change and probably one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the pay sector of employment law for some time now. The reason why these changes have been brought into effect is that the government, so the Labour government, when they took charge in the summer of 2024, set out on a very ambitious plan to rationalise, to promote, to enforce employment law rights. And this change is part of those overall rights and is aimed at addressing the cost of living crisis and improving wages for low-paid workers. I think it's widely recognised and accepted that whilst these changes are going to bring opportunities, They are also going to bring challenges for employers and for businesses looking to survive in ever more challenging markets. So in summary, what are the changes? So the first is the change to the national minimum wage. For those aged 21 and over, the national living wage will rise by 6.7% from £11.44 to £12.21 per hour. Doesn't sound, when you say 6.7%, it doesn't sound hugely onerous, but as you can see what impact it has on the hourly rate of pay that we're going to have to pay our staff moving forwards across the business, this is going to have a very seismic impact. For younger workers, the change is even greater. So we're going to see wages for younger workers, so those aged between 18 and 20, the wage rise is going to be a whopping 16.3%. Rising from £8.79 per hour to £10 per hour. Alongside that, national minimum wage increases are something we're used to seeing year in, year out. These rates are always reviewed at the start of the new financial year, the start of the new tax year, and so it's something we've seen year in, year out in April. This year, we have the added burden of the increase in national insurance contributions, which will also come into effect next month. And employers' national insurance contributions are going to rise from 13.8% to 15%. But alongside that, we're also going to see the threshold at which employers are liable to pay national insurance will drop from a starting figure of £9,100 per annum to just £5,000 per annum. And so as a result of that, a lot of lower paid part-time workers are going to be captured by the burden of increased national insurance contributions. And I think it's widely accepted that these changes are significant and they are going to be felt most acutely in sectors that rely on low paid workers and workers that earn the minimum wage, which obviously is something that we do see a lot across the care sector. So putting those changes into context, what difference is this going to make? In terms of wage costs, so a care home with 50 employees working at the national living wage rate could see its average wage bill increase by around £20,000 to £30,000 a year, which is an additional significant burden on a sector that's already struggling, as we know, to make the books balance. In terms of national insurance contributions, the example there is somebody earning £1,000 a week. That's probably not somebody that's going to be captured to a great extent in this sector, but somebody earning £1,000 a week is now going to cost the employer a whopping £150 more per week due to the increase in the national insurance rate. So this is going to lead to a substantial impact in overheads and is going to place a significant financial strain on smaller care homes and independent providers. In essence, we're going to need to do more with the same, or in most cases, we're going to need to do more with less. And balancing the books and keeping staff happy alongside that is going to be a challenge. What we can see is that for even the most modest sized care home, this is likely to result in tens of thousands of pounds of increased costs over the course of a calendar year. That's going to have an overall impact on operating costs at a time when we see budgets being squeezed elsewhere because of the rising cost of living, so the rising cost of food, the rising cost of utility bills, and the concern is that this could tip some small independent providers into financial difficulty and may make the difference between whether they're able to continue trading or not. Hopefully not all doom and gloom. Hopefully we'll come on to some of the more positive impacts and steps that businesses are going to be able to take. Why are we doing this? I started with why the government has addressed the national minimum wage increases and the national insurance increases in this year. But in essence, this is to ensure, as part of the wider package of employment law reforms, that workers, employees within the United Kingdom are paid fairly and that their conditions are fair. It recognises that those that are quite often earning minimum wage are doing the most challenging and emotionally demanding work in the most challenging and emotionally demanding environments, but they do vital work. And so it's important, and the government recognises the importance of ensuring that those workers are adequately and fairly compensated for the work that they do. It's going to lead to employers needing to think about whether they can actually manage sustainable pay increases going forward. So if you have an annual pay review process as part of your business that sits outside and alongside increases in national minimum wage, I imagine that this is something that employers are going to need to have a look at and see whether actually those additional annual pay increases are going to be sustainable in a more challenging environment, which is probably going to mean that employers need to look at their policies, they need to look at their contracts, they need to look at whether these things are fit for purpose and whether they are properly considering how they're going to manage their workforce going forward in this environment. And this is really, as the slide says, it's about striking that balance between offering competitive wages, but also ensuring that the financial health of the care provider is maintained. We don't want to compromise the ability to continue providing care. And so it is going to be a challenge, but I think if struck correctly, we can balance that challenge between providing quality care, but also looking after our workforces alongside that. It's probably going to lead to care home managers, care home owners having to look at other ways in which they can reward their staff that isn't necessarily about paying them extra money on a month or annual basis. So what opportunities are there for career development? What opportunities are there to ask for access to training? Are there other non-wage benefits that businesses can offer that will mitigate the impacts of these rises, that will ensure that we keep a happy and healthy workforce, whilst alongside that also maintaining a competitive nature? So is there training and development opportunities that we can offer to our workers to help them develop their skills and progress within the sector that means that they remain a happy workforce, a healthy workforce, and a workforce that wants to continue to work for us? Because alongside the added cost of these rises, we also have to recognise that a churn of staff, a high turnover, an ever revolving door of staff also has a negative impact on the bottom line of the business. Businesses are probably going to have to promote worker well-being far better than they do at the moment. So is there better mental health support that we can offer to staff? Are there other benefits that we can offer to them, such as reduced gym memberships or employment, employee advice programs that we can offer where we can provide support that doesn't break the bank in providing this, but again, just mitigates the impact on the workforce? And we're going to need to be transparent and communicate carefully with our employees. And we'll come on it in a couple of slides' time to why that becomes ever more important when businesses are looking as to how they're going to align and manage these increased costs. We know that the healthcare, the social care sector has its recruitment and retention challenges. Historically, it's an area that's always being blunt, wages have been quite low. A lot of employees within the sector are paid at minimum wage. Hours can be long, hours can be unsociable. As I mentioned earlier, work can be very emotionally and physically demanding. And this is more, it's all about more than competitive wages. It's about more than giving staff in financial terms what we need to bring them into the sector. We need people to be able to see that career progression is a possibility within the sector, and that if they join, it's a vocation, it's a career, it's something that they can develop for life. But once we've encouraged people into the sector, we need to make sure that we're then retaining those staff because, as I say, as well as the added bonus and benefit and burden of paying higher wages, we also have to recognise that a revolving door mentality has very significant and negative impacts on the business. So we see high turnover rates within the sector, the burnout, the lure of better opportunities. So can I go and earn the same amount of money somewhere else doing a job that has better hours and better working environment? And the vicious cycle of constant recruitment, training and lost knowledge. So where should we focus our efforts? Businesses are also going to have to be very, very careful that the impacts of the revolving door mentality doesn't actually just undermine its position more and more. Unhappy staff members leaving lead to more unhappy staff members leaving, and so the cycle goes on. Businesses are also going to have to think about how they're going to absorb the increased costs that come with the increase in both the national minimum wage and the national insurance payments. Because if businesses are unable to absorb the increased costs, then we're going to need to look, and we'll come on to this in a moment, at the potential that businesses need to cut the hours that people are working, and ultimately whether they need to actually look at cutting jobs and look at some restructure or redundancy type process. Improving pay is only part of the equation. The focus, I think, has to be on improving workplace conditions, career development and support for workers. But also, the government needs to put its money where its mouth is, and I don't want to be overly political in saying this, but these increases have been brought into a sector where they're going to impact the greatest. So is there anything else the government can do to support? What about subsidised training programmes? What about subsidised mental health support or career progression pathways? Is this further funding that this sector needs in order to remain competitive in an ever increasingly challenging employment market? Businesses are going to have to make sure that they are managing their workforce expectations and that there is transparent, open and objective communication. So manage your workforce's expectations. Let them know what you are doing. Let them know what the long-term benefits and the long-term intentions for your business is going to be. Yes, this is about balancing corporate responsibility and making sure that we are supporting our staff, but we also need to make sure that we're also being quite clear about what the financial sustainability of the business is going to be and how you as business owners are going to manage and succeed with that. Keep your employees engaged, have regular meetings, surveys, focus groups, and so on and so forth. Identify challenges early, foster a sense of ownership. When workers feel their voices are heard, they are more likely to feel engaged and committed. And so if there are difficult times ahead, be honest and open about that. Get people on board, get their input, get their views, and let's make this a business that everybody wants to be part of and everybody wants to survive. And then finally, just looking at some steps and measures that businesses can put in place to make sure that they are managing the financial impacts of these rate rises, and alongside that are sustaining care quality. I'm sure that this is something that Cornerstone are going to come on to in far more detail in due course, but it's going to become ever more important now for businesses to look at their financial efficiency and their cost management, look at ways to operate more efficiently. Are there ways that you can streamline your administration tasks? Are there ways that you can improve your staff scheduling so that you make sure you have the right people on shift at the right time and you are managing the salary budget that you've got most effectively? Businesses are probably going to have to look at diversifying funding and income streams, but being careful not to avoid a two-tier system where those that can afford to pay get a better quality of service than those that can't. Increasing service efficiency without compromising quality, and as I've already touched on there, government support. And sadly, if all else fails, businesses need to grasp the nettle as early as possible. And if it is going to be necessary to look at restructuring or rationalising your workforce, if redundancies are a possibility, if dismissals are a possibility, then acting on that quickly, having proper measures, processes, and consultation in place to ensure that you don't fall foul of the regulations or the law. And that brings me to my final point, and that is ensure compliance. We all know that employment law is a legal minefield. It's ever changing, and it's only going to change even more as this new government brings more measures into law over the coming 12 to 18 months. So we need to make sure that we are on top of those changes, that we are ensuring compliance. We don't want to face unnecessary tribunal claims or fines because we've not paid the national minimum wage properly. So keep on top of what you're doing, keep records in order, and I'm sure that's something Jenny will come on to in due course as well. But if all else fails, take advice, seek guidance, early doors, and hopefully we can manage this impact and make sure that we sustain successful businesses. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. That's really helpful. And I think it gives us a good baseline of understanding of what's happening in the sector and what the impact could be. And I know that coming up, we've got some good practical help on what it might look like and what businesses can do. But before we get to that, I invite Sabina to take control of the slides, and we're going to cover the understanding and impact on skilled worker visas and their thresholds.
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. So Juliet's gone through what the different changes in terms of that will be taking place and how they impact employers in general. I'll be looking at it more through an immigration lens. So we've already recognised that there'll be increased labour costs, higher wages for employees, budget strain on the organisations. And I guess that goes a little bit further in the care sector, especially where we have sponsored employees, where we have a shortage of skills. So we're relying on migrant workers in order to fill these skills gaps. And with your domestic employees who have the right to remain in the UK without having to have a visa or sponsorship, the higher wages will have an impact as it is. But with sponsored employees, and that will go a little bit further because, as we know, there's already costs involved with taking on migrant workers. So, for example, assigning certificates of sponsorship, paying immigration skills charges. So that's an additional cost to what you would be paying to your domestic worker. Juliet's also spoken about recruitment and retention. And I think the impact on the care sector with regards to this from an immigration perspective is that my most recent experience is a lot of the care workers that we've been supporting are actually not new entrants into the UK on the care worker visa. They're actually moving from other care homes looking for roles, new roles, similar roles. And again, the only reason behind that could be is better the work environment, or obviously we understand the strains and stresses with regards to staffing shortages. So with that regard, I guess the higher wages make the healthcare jobs a little bit more appealing for workers who are coming in from the UK looking for jobs, and migrants who are, for example, students and graduates in the UK, and they're looking to a part-time job or fill these gaps where we don't have the sponsor licenses. With regards to visas and compliance in terms of meeting minimum salary requirements, the increase in the rates will assist to make sure that organizations may be able to fill gaps where previously they didn't meet the Home Office requirements for the thresholds with regards to what is required to be met for other roles. So we have the care worker roles, which are normally in line with the national minimum wage, but then there's other roles within the same categories that require higher wages, which may not previously have been met. But the increase to the salary means that those can now be accommodated. And it's really important to make sure that we don't fall into the we don't fall foul of the rules, because I've had employers who have thought because they're in a fixed term contract with a migrant worker that's already got a visa and they've already sponsored them for next 3 years, if the wage increases, that it would not apply to those employees. That's not correct. So even if you're in a contract and you're sponsoring somebody already, if the national minimum wage changes, you are required to ensure that the wage change also applies to your migrant workers. And that's because you don't just have a duty to comply with the immigration rules. One of the requirements for the sponsor license holders is that they have to ensure that they're in compliance with wider UK laws, which would include employment law. And hence, it's really important that the salaries are also reviewed for the migrant workers. Again, Juliet's covered this, but what I did want to touch on, I haven't quoted it in my slide, but there's a white paper that will be published later on this year regarding graduate workers. My understanding, again, from working with employers, is where they're not sponsoring employees themselves, they are filling those skills shortages with maybe students, migrants who are students in the UK able to do part-time hours, or they've been relying heavily on those that are on graduate route visas that are able to take on work with them. So the graduate route was introduced in 2021 as a flexible option for newly qualified graduates who haven't yet secured skilled employment, but they're able to take on other work on a flexible basis. And a lot of those people have actually taken on care work. But in a bid to reduce net migration as a part of the government strategy last year, it has now been put forward that they want to change it so that graduates are no longer able to take on work that is not graduate entry level. So if it's work that doesn't require you to have a degree, then you're not allowed to take that work on. So the finer details aren't clear yet. It will be more clear when the white paper's published, but I thought it'd be important to let you know, because if you're an organization that has graduates working for them and are reliant on them assisting, then you might have to take some early steps to look at whether, if you don't have a sponsor license, whether you want to keep these people on and they want to stay with you on a long term, and whether you want to sponsor them. And in relation to today's talk, again, the wage changes and the increases will help to secure that type of work where previously maybe they wouldn't have been interested. So when we have changes to wages, etc., we are required to report it to the Home Office when you hold a sponsor license. So a sponsor license requirements expect you to ensure that any changes to your organization or changes to your workers, or that impact your workers, your migrant workers, are reported on the sponsor management system. And so if there's an increase or a decrease in the salary, if the actual role changes, or if, for example, you have to let somebody go, or hours have to be reduced because there's not enough work, etc., it's really important that these changes are recorded on the SMS system. And if these changes aren't reported, then it can have an impact on your actual sponsor license. When should we report? So once you've reported the change, so let's say the wage comes into force, we've increased the wages, it's really important that within 10 working days, we've logged into the SMS system and recorded this change for each employee against their certificate. To ensure that the record's there for the Home Office. And this is really important because if you ever get a sponsor license review from the Home Office, it can impact your actual license, because if you're shown to be non-compliant or you fail to record it, it can prevent you from employing further migrants or employing any migrants. And also, any changes in the wages could have visa implications. So, for example, if there was a decrease in the wage, you'd no longer meet the visa requirement, and therefore it's really important to make sure that these things are looked at on a regular basis. And if there's any effective changes, like this is going to be a big change. And for those organizations, some who have seen employ up to 200 migrants, and these changes there'll be some administrative costs just to ensure that the SMS management system is kept up to date. Consequences of failing to report: it could be penalties, suspension, or revocation. It can affect the actual visas of the employees, so you may no longer be able to employ them. And again, like I said, it can prevent you from being able to employ further migrants. So it might be that they allow you to continue to employ those that you have, but it will stop you from employing further migrants in the future. And other responsibilities are to ensure that you keep records of this, not just on the SMS system, but on your general HR records about any changes that have taken place. And we have to make sure that all of the conditions of the visas continue to be met. Key things, it is a difficult one. Yes, there's implications on the actual operational costs for the organizations, and it does on the other side for the employees it's better because you attract them into the sector, you're able to fill the gaps and hopefully retain them. So really, I guess it's a balancing exercise to make sure that it's all balanced out between operational costs and compliance, and making sure that we continue to provide good quality care. That's it from me. And if there's any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat box and we'll address them after. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. And that's a good reminder to everybody. I know that this is a lot of information we're throwing up at you this morning, but we'll save questions till the end so we can gather them all in one group. So if you want to put something in the chat or ask, it's a small enough group that you can just speak if you want to at the end. It would be good to have a discussion about what we've gone through today. So thank you, Sabina. We've spoken about the theory, the law, and now we're going to talk about the practical aspects of what these changes mean and how it's going to affect your business. So I invite Lucy and Charlie of Cornerstone Care Solutions to go through that with us now.
Thank you, Jenny. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Lucy Corner. I'm the Managing Director of Cornerstone Care Solutions. We are a consultancy that supports all sorts of care services in lots of various different ways, but we support them mainly operationally through issues and troubleshooting, and sometimes insolvency. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the points that we can do to mitigate some of these issues that have been mentioned before. So we already know that staffing is typically the largest expense in healthcare environments. So typically you're looking at 50 or 60% of income going out on operating costs relating to staff. In some services, that could be in the region of 70 and 80%, depending on the level of fees that people are getting or the amount of staff that you need to use. So staffing really is one of the key things that we need to look at to reduce, to try and save some of these costs. Unfortunately, also with the national minimum wage and the national insurance contribution hikes, that is also going to be the biggest hike cost to the business that we'll see for a while. So some other key financial pressures, other than the environmental ones that we already know about, such as raising oil, gas, electricity costs, obviously wages are increasing. That has an impact on agency staff costs as well, because those staff still need to be paid national minimum wage contributions, etc. Recruitment and onboarding expenses are things people don't often think about, but they're really important when it comes to turnover. And if you have a high turnover of staff, you end up having to retrain, you end up having to put out adverts for recruitment. And if you need to have specialist staff such as nurses or clinical leads, you'll find then that you'll need to pay maybe 10% recruitment fee to recruiters when you're recruiting those types of those quality staff. So it's really important that we work out how to keep hold of those, and we've got a few tips for you on doing that today. Again, training and development, that's a high cost that goes into recruiting. When you bring somebody in, you need to do their induction. They need to have some supernumerary time to get to know the service. And that is also another cost. So if we can reduce the turnover of staff, then we can hopefully save some money. And that's a really important thing to think about as well. So we're going to have a little look into how we can do that. So first of all, agency staff is an issue that a lot of care homes or care services have to use. We need to keep our services safe. We need to make sure that we do have agency staff available. Obviously, the cost of those could be double the cost that you would pay your normal staff. So it would be really helpful if you have your own bank of staff that you can rely on that will come in and do some of these shifts. And hopefully that will save some of the cost on you having that. Obviously, that will save you some money. It will also bring continuity of care to the people that you're looking after. And you can do that via various methods. We can do things like offering overtime to staff that we use. We can offer attendance incentives, so encouraging people to not phone in sick for shifts, and if they have a certain attendance record, that they get some kind of incentive at the end of that. Looking at recruitment and retention, culture is something we really need to focus on to make sure that staff want to come to work and they enjoy it. So having a look at the attitude of the managers and the way that they manage their staff and training them in approaching their staff will have a really big impact on being able to get staff to engage and enjoy their work and want to come into work. So making sure that the whole team understands the ethos of the business can really go towards making sure that that turnover is reduced. We can look at other things such as staff benefits, which I know has been briefly touched upon. We can look at bonus schemes as well. Hopefully not all financial bonus schemes, but again, it might be worth putting in a little bit of money to then save quite a lot at the other end. So it's important to look at that. Celebrating things like employee achievements and putting them in for awards. It doesn't cost anything to put people in for care awards, and they are all over the country, and that's a really, really good thing that staff really enjoy. And even if they don't get to attend the awards or they can't attend the awards, knowing that they've been nominated and potentially to win an award is a really good boost for them as an individual. So I would definitely recommend spending a little bit of time putting some people in for awards. Look at the culture of the staff, but also maybe develop a training team or a team that will support new employees coming in. A lot of the time we see services where new staff come in and it's the same seniors that are training them. The seniors maybe don't really have the right attitude to be training people, or they might not want to, or they might feel that they're constantly the person that ends up having to train staff and they don't like it or they don't want to do it. And actually that won't present the best for your organisation. So we recommend having someone that really enjoys that role, is a real people's person and can bring people in, make them feel at home and hopefully settle them in really quickly. That will reduce some of your absenteeism, because we find as well a lot of staff that are working with new staff all the time, they tend to get quite frustrated with having the burden of training new people all the time. And then they can be short with them or get them to do some of the tedious jobs and things like that, which can also have an impact on the service and whether that person will want to stay. So that's really important. Again, when we recruit staff, we need to be looking at recruiting the right people in the first place. I know, again, a lot of services are really desperate, so they rush people in and they might have a question mark on their CV, but they rush them in. And then after a couple of weeks, that person isn't right for the service, or they decide that they don't like the service and they move on. So it is really important that we have a really good system in place to manage that. So going into a bit of detail about absenteeism and overtime. So sickness is a really big issue in healthcare services, and managing that will really help with employee costs. So looking at why there is a sickness and looking into the details of those things, following your policies and procedures to make sure that back to work interviews are managed and things like that, so that there is an expectation that staff will be managed if they have sickness. Obviously some can't be avoided, but if there are people that are using that as a substitute for annual leave, hopefully you will be able to manage that and wheedle some of those things out. Again, one of the things that we see a lot in care homes is annual leave being mismanaged. And if a manager doesn't have a grip on annual leave, or they feel that they can't challenge staff on taking too much or not booking it in until the last minute and then suddenly wanting to take loads, We find that really impacts the service, and some managers don't have the confidence to challenge the staff on those things, but also some managers don't look at annual leave until the last minute, right at the end of the year, and they realise that they have so many staff left to take their annual leave that they can't possibly fit it all in without using lots of agency. Again, lots of companies we work with have policies whereby if staff don't use their annual leave by the end of the year, they lose it. And if that's strictly enforced, again, that will cause a lot of problems towards the end of the year. So it's really important. We recommend each quarter that somebody manages that annual leave quite closely and speaks to any staff with a lot of annual leave outstanding, or that's taken more than half their annual leave halfway through the year, just to check in and make sure that they're not burning themselves out and that they are going to leave enough annual leave to get them to the end of the year. And it works both ways. We don't want people to take too much annual leave too soon because they might phone in sick towards the end of the year, and vice versa. We don't want people not to take any annual leave and then suddenly at Christmas want to take it all, if their annual leave finishes, December time or indeed in March. So that brings me nicely on to the Christmas rota, which is everybody's headache in health and social care. And that really needs to be managed in advance, and looking at that Christmas rota and coming up with a really inventive way of managing that can help with sickness, covering those days where typically Christmas is time and a half or double time. We don't really want to be using agency because it will cost a huge amount of money over Christmas. So we offer incentives with staff whereby we maybe break up the shift pattern at Christmas. So maybe in November, we will speak to all the staff and say, right, we're happy to reduce the shifts to over these period of days, we will do 4-hour shifts instead of 8-hour shifts. And you can choose if you pick up a shift in the morning at Christmas, for example, you could do it late at New Year. Something like that. And sometimes you can give staff the opportunity to build their own rota, with the caveat that if it isn't complete or people don't volunteer, then the manager will have to step in and do it. So it gives them the incentive that if they work together as a team, that they can choose the hours that suit them. And it also gives us a bit of an idea of what shifts they would pick up. And we try and ask people to work Christmas or New Year, and then the following year it's the other way around. So we try and make sure that it's fair and everybody knows what's expected of them, and then it isn't a shock when it comes to Christmas. So there are a few little tips over the rota system to hopefully streamline things. So to sort costs a little bit more and look at the increased costs, there are some other things that we can do, which Charlie will talk about in a bit more detail. But looking at the staffing structure overall, I'm sure everyone will be doing that, but we need to make sure that we have a dependency tool that matches the quality of care that we need to provide. So we need to look at how dependent the residents are, and not necessarily just rely on a manager or whoever it is that does the rota, because again, they might always insist that we need 5 staff, even when we reduce our occupancy by a certain number. So it's really important we've got an eye on the dependency of the service and make sure that we match the staff to that. Again, one final point in relation to the rota is that, again, we go into lots of services where the rota is managed a week in advance or 2 weeks in advance, and this will have an impact on staff being able to plan their future shifts and events and things like that. So we try and encourage services to have at least 6 weeks rota out at any one time, and that gives managers plenty of time to look ahead. And if a staff member can come to them then and say, in 3 weeks' time, I'm not able to make this shift. So instead of having somebody phone in sick, you might have a planned swap of a shift, rather than somebody at short notice dropping that shift and you having to rush to find it. So that's it from me. I'm now going to pass you over to Charlie, who will talk a little bit more about overall cost savings in care services.
Thank you very much. So my name's Charlie. I'm the operations manager for Cornerstone Care Solutions. So I'm just going to look at some practical areas that we can look at, kind of quick wins. Now, some of it will feed into what Lucy and Juliet mentioned earlier, because the importance around staffing at the moment is essential with the challenges we're going to face. So looking at first at workforce planning Lucy mentioned before about a dependency tool. It's important that we look at people's needs rather than their care category. So you could have somebody, we all know in a dependency tool we have kind of your 4 categories. You have your dementia, your residential, your dementia residential, your nursing, and you have all these categories, and we kind of put people in those boxes rather than having somebody that's got nursing needs, but they're so independent, you know, so we wouldn't put them in that nursing category. We'd put them in a need that meets them. So understanding your dependency tool and making it work for your home is so important, and from that you would then build your rota based on your dependency, whereas a lot of time they're not done in parallel, they're done completely separately. Okay, so make sure you bring those two together. That's a real practical way to have safe staffing. Looking at investing retention, now I know Juliet mentioned before and Lucy did as well around how we can support staff to feel valued, but it's also important to look at how we recruit within. So whenever we need a role, we have, in a small care home, you can have, say, 20 staff, and we think, right, okay, we've had our administrator leave, we need an admin. Now, within your organisation and within your care staff, you may have someone that is amazing on a computer, that really understands and has good relationship with your residents and their families. You know, so rather than spending the money on getting someone external, recruiting that way, you could do it within. So look at the workforce that you have already and invest in the staff that you have, because if you invest in them and grow them as a person, they'll continue to be loyal to your organisation and to your home. When we look at reducing agency dependency, I know Lucy mentioned before, it's having a strong onboarding and support system for your staff teams, and make sure that it's followed. A lot of the time when somebody comes in, we're already short staffed, so they turn up for their induction and it's, oh, just go off with this person, shadow this person, and we lose sight of making them feel valued initially as they walk through the door as an employee, that they are worth our time to invest in them within that home. So make sure that's done. It's also important that we look at supervision, making sure that they understand there's this thing that we like to use called resilience-based clinical supervision for our nursing teams and our staff that they support. It's making sure they understand their role so staff don't get burned out by just trying to muddle along. Really give that evidence of support to your staff. That'll then reduce your agency dependency, because people will understand their role, they won't feel burned out, that will reduce their stress levels. And we all know if we're not stressed, we're enjoying our day, you know, so that's important. Looking at shorter shifts. Now, I know Lucy mentioned before about the Christmas rota, that's a perfect way to do it. But also when there is a last minute shift that somebody drops, someone rings in sick for, look and see, is there 4 people that can come in for those 4 hours? We don't have to ring around staff saying, can you come in for a 12-hour shift? Because I know if I got called on my day off for a 12-hour shift, I think, oh God, no. But if they said, can you come in for 4 hours? I'd think, oh yeah, I'll come in for 4 hours, and offer those incentives to reduce the agency costs. If you need to get agency in for 4 hours, it's much better than getting them in for 12 hours. Looking at optimizing your training investments. Now, we work a lot in care homes where they think, okay, we have our online training, we have our face-to-face training, and this is how we meet compliance. But there's so many blended courses you can do now, so many blended ways to do it. And also, if you're a small organisation, look at your sister homes that are in the same commissioning group as you, that you have these provider chats with, and look at sharing. This is the time when we have to come together in the health and social care. We're not just standalone homes. We have to support each other, and we have to unite our tools and resources. So don't be shy. Ring the home down the road and say, you know what, I've got a training booked for next week. I have 2 spaces available. Do you have anyone that you want to send on that? And then, you know, when you have some spaces, would you mind contacting our home? So there's lots of ways you can support each other in the sector to get through training, and look at what training works for your home, and look at more competency-based training rather than sending someone away for 2 days. You could, you know, send them away for half a day and look at actually your nurses, your seniors, or yourself as providers, making sure that they are competent to carry out that training. And then looking at data-driven decisions. A lot of the time we collate data, but we don't use it effectively. It just sits there. So look at your rotas, look at your systems that you use for that and for your payroll systems, and they will identify gaps. They'll identify where there's trends and patterns in sick days, in, you know, where you're looking at where the days you're understaffed. Is it always on a bank holiday? You know, do we then look at incentives for a bank holiday to try and increase that, you know, staff doing that? It's use your data. So look at the systems and processes you have and look at, why are we collating this? Actually, what do we need to use this for to improve our services moving forward? Technology can really help us. It reduces areas for your handovers. So there's some great care systems out there that collate a handover, give you a lovely little chart, and then it's a quick verbal handover. So you could be paying for a 5-minute handover rather than a 15-minute handover. And that across the week, the months, the year will save you a lot of money. So some of the key takeaways from this conversation is, by actually assessing the financial impacts and applying strategies. So basically, it's just a posh way of saying plan for your future. Look at now, look at what's working, what isn't working, and plan to make it better, and actually see that strategy through. We can then maintain some costs. One of the things that we haven't really mentioned here, but is just one of my pet peeves in healthcare, is look at your suppliers. And I'm telling, especially small care homes at the moment, please spend time, look at what you're paying out for your suppliers. We went into one care home recently and managed to save them, I think it managed about £5,000 a month, by reviewing all of their suppliers for them. So please look at that. So if you're going to take any takeaway from this, please just go and have a little look through your invoices and have a bit of a shop about. So thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And Lucy, that was really, really helpful. It's kind of the practical application of what we've been discussing throughout the morning. Before I carry on, I just wanted to say, earlier I said anybody can ask their question verbally, but I'm told that will not work because of the function of the webinar. If you do have a burning question, stick it in the Q&A box and I will be able to read that out at the end. I have a few questions myself, so we'll bring those up in a moment. But before we get to that point, I'm just going to kind of touch on the regulator's view and how the CQC and local authorities will consider the impact of what we've been discussing on providers. Before I launch into it, I just wanted to kind of touch on some political movements around the increase in national insurance for health and social care providers. Last month, the House of Lords debated this issue, the proposal to increase the national insurance contributions, and whether or not social care, health and social care, should be exempted from that increase. The NHS is exempted, but health and social care providers, hospices, care homes, charitable organisations are not. And recognising that financial strain, the House of Lords actually passed an amendment to exempt providers from that increase. But what that means is it's going to be debated. It doesn't mean that exemption takes effect. What it means is that this is what the House of Lords believes should happen, and now it moves on up to the House of Commons. They're going to consider it and discuss whether or not there should be an exemption for our sector, and that discussion is actually going to happen on the 19th, so a week today. So there have been some groups celebrating that, and it is progress, but it doesn't mean that anything is solid just yet. It just means that the House of Commons is going to think about what the House of Lords has suggested. So in terms of that's my mistake. In terms of what I'm going to discuss, all of these extra overheads, what is that going to mean for providers in terms of the duties that they owe to the regulator and local authorities? And I think Juliet hit the nail on the head when she said that you are going to have to do more with less. So the structure of the CQC's regime means that you still have to evidence good practice. You have to provide evidence that you're meeting regulations. If you turn around and say, well, we've had to cut training, that isn't going to cut it with the CQC. You can't say, well, we've had to cut shifts because we don't have money for the overheads of staff. That's not going to cut it either. So whilst there are going to be things that you may have to amend and adjust slightly, you still have those extremely high standards, and the CQC will hold you account to those. In terms of your relationships with local authorities, if you're going to have to pay out more, then surely your fees should increase as standard. In an ideal world, they would, but that isn't always the case. We've got local authorities going bankrupt all over the country. We have fees stagnating or being increased at glacial rates. Now, there was a little bit of hope in the SARCP case. We saw that as a success for the sector. But in practical terms, how do we use it? I just wanted to talk about what that means for the sector. For those that don't know about that case, it was a High Court ruling back in January against Stoke-on-Trent City Council. And it was against their decision to increase residential care home fees by only 1.4% for 24-25. And the court deemed that decision was unlawful on multiple grounds. Now, the action was brought by SARCP, representing local care homes, and arguing that that minimal fee increase did not reflect the actual cost of providing quality care. Lots of care homes had to close as a consequence. Vulnerable people were displaced. Now, the court identified 5 key failings. The council failed to properly consider responses from care providers during the consultation process on fee increases and how much it cost. They failed to comply with the Care Act. So they didn't consider the actual costs of care like inflation, increases to national living wage, failure to consider relevant factors, breach of public sector equality duty in the Equality Act 2010, and irrational decision making. Now, as a consequence, the court actually quashed the council's decision and mandated a reassessment within 28 days, emphasising the need for a proper consultation. And the point was that the council hadn't adhered to statutory guidance or a thorough consideration of what the actual costs were. Now, what that meant is that the council had said, we're giving you 1.4% and we're not explaining why. And that is what the court took issue with. Now, the council were told, go back, do a reassessment and come back with a real fee increase suggestion. So in order to comply with what the court required, they did a full assessment of what care costs. They did it thoroughly so as to meet the Care Act. And lo and behold, they came back with a 1.4% increase. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the increase had to be changed. It just meant that the rationale the council gave had to be more detailed. Now, the reason that that's important is if you're getting fee increase suggestions from your local authority and they're not detailed, there's no quantification of what care costs, or you've put forward a really detailed assessment of what it really does cost to care for people, then that is what can be challenged. And I would urge you to challenge local authorities when there's no rationale for a poor fee increase. When you're asking for an increase, give as much detail as possible. And then when the council come back or the commissioner comes back with a fee that isn't appropriate, you can challenge them on the basis that you've given a real summary of what the costs are and they've ignored it. And that's where this decision would come into play. And you might have a much better argument in getting a higher fee rate. Now, to wrap things up, it's time to innovate. It's time to do more with less. We've had some wonderful suggestions today, practical tips of things that you can do to improve culture, to keep people working well for not a lot of money. And I think that the crucial thing here is to just keep delivering and working hard to meet the regulations, which will always stay the same until there's a seismic change in the law. And whilst that happens, we're just going to have to batten down the hatches and keep progressing and hope that councils and commissioners see sense and understand how much it does cost you to deliver care given all of these increases. Now, that brings us to a close, and I'm so grateful for everybody's time today, everybody that's spoken, everybody that's attended. And I think I just had one point of discussion, really, one quick question before we move on. And it's really to Lucy and Charlie. In my line of work, I see regulatory issues that have arisen when, there are problems with staff, whistleblowing, lots of reports, complaints, and it always points to culture. And you've spoken today about what you can do to improve culture and how that impacts the attitude of staff and the feeling within the home. I see a lot of horror stories and bad news situations in my line of work, but could you share on the ground what difference it makes to have a happy team and how that can filter into the regulatory aspect of delivering care?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one because we've seen this quite recently, actually. So the impact. So care is hard. We all know that. When you're on shift, you normally do 4 long days a week, and you live and breathe with these people. They become, whether they're enemies or friends, they become people that you have to see for most of your week. So we're all human. We all don't like everybody we meet, and they don't like us, and that's okay. But what we find is that, unfortunately, a lot of the time with staff culture, it comes down to management. And that's hard because some of us are managers and we've been managers. But sometimes we're so intent on evidencing the care, evidencing our operational data, that we sometimes fail to look on the floor and see what's going on, on a day-to-day basis. Your walk-arounds in homes are so important for noticing how staff interact, and we forget to do that a lot of the time. So what you need to do is to regularly, the supervisions are always the last thing again to do. Make sure you're supervising your staff, make sure you're looking at how your staff are interacting with each other, because the impact that can have is, from a scale of 1 to 10, could go to a 9. So if you have staff that do not get along, they are so consumed by that relationship when they're on the floor that they forget to look at the quality of the care they're given. You'll find that if staff are not happy on the day because they're working with carer A and carer B who they don't like, they'll probably choose to go and use a piece of moving and handling equipment on their own rather than asking staff A and B. They'll rush around to do stuff on their own so that they don't have to work with staff A and B. So building the understanding of the professional relationships, and taking that apart from how you personally feel and making sure that they have that compartmentation. I think that's the essential area, reminding staff, because the consequences could be quite severe for their practice and for the residents.
Thank you, Charlie. That's really helpful. And it's something that I see almost every time with an issue. It starts with people. Okay, again, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any further questions that you didn't want to ask today, here is a final slide with all of our contact details contained therein. We're going to have a copy of this recording saved somewhere and circulated, and a copy of the slides. So please feel free to share with colleagues and anybody that might find this interesting. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Thanks to all of our wonderful speakers, and we look forward to the next event. If you have any suggestions of topics that you'd like us to discuss, please drop me a line, and we look forward to you joining us again. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.